From the television studios of the House of Representatives in Washington, D.C., this is Ask Congress with Lester Wolf.
I don't know about you, but it seems each day I'm more confused about statements that emanate from the media, or what the media characterizes as informed sources or highly placed persons. I'm deeply concerned about the credibility of these reports and whether or not the facts are real or some garbage that's been distilled from the rumor factories that are so pervasive these days. Now, mind you, I'm one of the staunchest advocates of press freedom. My background before I came to the Congress was news-oriented. I believe that freedom of the press is one of the basic foundations of liberty. However, I'm appalled at the misuse of freedom that is destructive of that which we seek to protect. Orwell's 1984 is long since past. However, the doublespeak of the liars who figure and the figures who lie make Orwell the Nostradamus of the present age. Two areas are of greatest concern. First and foremost is the trial by press. Any individual or group singled out by the media can be dumped upon without any means available for redress save that little correction box that is carefully hidden in some obscure corner of your daily newspaper. The rights of the individual as well as the rights of the press were clearly articulated in the Constitution and the exquisitely drafted Bill of Rights. Yet, as a result of the desire of some in the media to come up with the exclusive, our individual rights are being destroyed through the professional greed or the non-professional greed of a news beat, in many cases by a grain reporter who lacks the professionalism to understand the circumstances surrounding the story, who by innuendo or distortion editorializes what is supposed to be a straight representation of the facts. This, too, is exacerbated by the headline seekers in our midst who compound this grievance by prejudging the situation. And I'm referring to recent stories by irresponsible individuals who have pronounced judgments that even our protectors of the courts have failed to reach. But to all of this another time. What we're here today to discuss is the second gripe, and I'm sure that you share what is the gross confusion that is stemming from what are seemingly official figures coming from government sources about where we stand as a nation, and the use of these figures as the foundation of our determining our future lifestyle. I'm talking about the recent furor over our debt and the ways and means that we use in correcting this threat. Where do we stand today? Are we so in hock that we will have to turn back the clock of what is the world's most advanced society to get a true picture of where we stand? Stripping away the gobbledygook of ponderous statistics, we have two well-informed members of the Congress who will today give us the true facts, the straight talk. And I'm very happy to have with us today Congressman Bob Carr of Michigan. Congressman Carr is a member of the Appropriations Committee, a member of the subcommittees on Commerce, Justice, State, and Judiciary, and a member of the Transportation Subcommittee from Michigan's 6th District. And seated next to him, one of the few accountants in the Congress, one of the few CPAs, Congressman DioGuardi, a Republican of New York's 20th District, member of the Government Operations Committee on Legislation and National Security, of the Government Information, Justice, and Agriculture Subcommittees, member of the Small Business Committee, Oversight in the Economy, and the Select Committee on Narcotics. You got a lot on your hands, Joe, for a freshman.
Well, I'm trying my best to bring my background to bear here in Congress, Les, and just like to start off by saying it's nice to be back with you again on your show. I think it's time that the word accountability took a front place in the lexicon of what goes on here in Congress. I've been here now for a little over a year, and I have to tell you that I'm appalled at what I've seen in 1 year as to the way we account for the dollars, the tax dollars that are brought here. Accounting is one thing, accountability is another. I think one follows from the other. I see my role as a congressman as a trustee of a big foundation. The foundation's called the United States of America. I think the key word for a fiduciary or a trustee is accountability. And I don't think we're being accountable because I don't see systems here that are reflecting economic reality on the books. Just two quick examples. We talk about the $2 trillion in debt. Well, that is measured by a Mickey Mouse accounting system called the cash basis. If you try to use that system and you were a public corporation, you'd literally be arrested by the SEC for fraud. And yet we have that system
You have
here.
congressional immunity.
Well, I would like to think that we can do something about it. And it seems to me that that system is wrong because it doesn't record our commitments. There are no pensions on the books. There are no guarantees, contingencies. And when you get to what's on the books, then you see what the General Accounting Officer said just recently in the press, that there are 427 different accounting systems. So how can we begin to understand what's happening here? And it's important, more than ever before, because with Graham-Rudman, the so-called Balanced Budget Act or Deficit Reduction Act, we need to begin to understand how these numbers come together so that we can do a good job in putting this country back on a strong road.
Bob, you're a member of the Appropriations Committee, and you have accountability all the time. You're the fellows that have to make a determination as to where the money will be spent. What restraints do you see upon you now as the result of this so-called Graham-Rudman? And especially, where do you stand so far as the President made a statement the other day that he wants a line veto?
Well, really, those are two different questions.
Yes.
Let me take them in turn. Graham-Rudman is a wild card right now. It's throwing all of the timetables and the methods of doing business that we've had in the past out the window, and we're having to reinvent the wheel a little bit here. That's not necessarily bad. Perhaps we should reinvent the wheel from time to time. Maybe we do a better job on that wheel, get a little rounder, maybe it'll roll a little better. I agree with my colleague from New York that part of our basic problem here is that we're suffering from accounting systems which would never fly in the private sector. It's frequently said that if I ran my business the way government runs its business, I'd be out of business. Well, to some extent, I don't think you can really say that, because we ask government to do a lot of things that by their very nature the private sector would not want to do. There's gray zones where the private sector really would like to. But I think that statement is truest when it talks about how we conduct ourselves and accounting and how we value certain accounting items is critical here. We know, for example, just recently the Joint Economic Committee had a symposium. Economists from around the country, from previous administrations, both Democratic and Republican, came together with their view that we picked the inappropriate measure of what the national debt is. And that indeed, if you follow Graham-Rudman, what you're going to end up with in 1991 is not a balanced budget, but a huge whopping surplus, which by its very nature may be the thing which would push this country into a recession. So we need, as Joe said, to get our accounting principles in order here in this government so that we can better understand what it is we're doing and when we're doing it. Now, as to the line item veto...
First of all, explain that. I think that the public would like to know what the President meant by a line item veto.
Well, in our process, we pass appropriations bills. And the President, and we pass them in the House, they pass them in the Senate, we come to a conference committee agreement, the House and Senate ratify that conference committee, and then it's sent to the President. Now, we send up 13 appropriations bills, and he can veto the whole appropriation if he would like. And that would mean, say, in the case of transportation, he'd have to veto the entire transportation appropriations. He couldn't go in and say, well, there is a piece of the appropriations bill that I like, and I'm going to approve that, and maybe this particular line item for Westway in New York, I don't like that, so I'd like to veto that. He has to take all of appropriations or none of appropriations under the current system. Indeed, when we get down to the end of the year and we have a continuing resolution or an omnibus appropriations bill where all of government is being packaged in one spending bill, the President is forced to take all or nothing there as well. The fact of the matter is, I don't think that's a bad thing to do in the federal system. The President continually talks about how 40-some governors have this power. I think that's a false comparison. The President of the United States, and I think he diminishes himself by making it, incidentally, the President of the United States is certainly no governor of a state. A governor of a state is not the leader of the free world. A governor of the state doesn't have the responsibility for the nation's security. The budgets of states are more, I'd say, like the budget of a major corporation. The budget of the United States government is a planning document for our entire economy. And I believe in checks and balances, and I believe that the system we have has worked fairly well, and I think we ought to continue it.
How do you feel about that, Joe, the idea of the president having the power to take some line from the overall budget and say, I'm going to veto that, not in any way detracting from his ability or his motivation, but is that how do you feel about it? Is that a good thing?
I believe it is. There are 43 governors that have it. I don't think the comparison is that far off. I think when you see the kind of legislation that we've had over the years, and I'll just point to one title, that's the Internal Revenue Code, and the many special interest provisions that got into that code to make it extremely complex because they were tacked on to legislation that legislators knew would pass. So they just put these on, and we've got the greatest example of Christmas tree legislation in the Internal Revenue Code itself. It's grown massively over the years. I started in the accounting profession in international accounting firm in 1962 and switched to the tax department in '64 and became a tax partner in '72. So I've witnessed literally the growth, the massive growth of that document. And when you have laws, you have to get regulations, then interpretations, and that's why we're with a tax bill that is just so complex that people find it easier to buy out of it than buy into it. But I think a line item veto is something that we should experiment with. The president has been asking for it. It seems logical to me that he should have the ability to look through legislation, to see what's good for this country, to see what's not good for this country, because congressmen don't seem to be able to do it. I think here, the philosophy that I've seen, or that I'd like to see, is that the needs of the whole, that's the country, are much greater than the sum of the parts. Those are the districts. What I've witnessed here less than 1 year, a congressman pulling on everything they can for their district, and I sense that the needs of the country, the good of the country, is almost playing second fiddle. I think we need to operate on two tracks, and line item veto would help do that.
What do you need a Congress for if you're going to have a Graham-Rudman, which makes a complete slice at one point, where if the Congress does not act, then you cut right down the line by a certain percentage in order to get to the balanced budget approach. And then you have a president who takes over the responsibility even for the individual items. What do you need a Congress for?
Well, the responsibility for the individual items obviously rests first with the Congress. And don't forget that Congress can override any presidential veto if they feel strongly enough about it. Getting to the Graham-Rudman side of it, I and many Republicans do not like the automatic sequestration provisions of Graham-Rudman. But we think Graham-Rudman is the best thing that's happened because it's an attention getter. I had likened Congress to a big mule. We needed something to get its attention, a 2x4, and I think we've got that 2x4 in Graham-Rudman, and I hope that we can set our priorities to reduce the deficit over the next 5 years, which is a simple target, without the automatic sequestration provisions of Graham-Rudman, and that's what we're working on as a party right now.
Well, I must step in at this moment, but I'd like to come back to you and ask about where you see the cuts coming as a result of this Graham-Rudman and how it will affect the average person. We'll be back to both of you in just a moment.
Jimmy with his first set of wheels. As Jimmy grew, he grew into bigger wheels. Pretty soon, Jimmy had adult wheels and thought he was a pretty big wheel himself. Jimmy drank and drove. Last year, nearly 1 million Americans like Jimmy were disabled in alcohol-related traffic accidents. Blue Cross and Blue Shield urges you to think before you drink. And Jimmy, now he's got a permanent set of wheels.
Yeah.
We have been talking about the whole question of something that has become part of our common lexicon today, the Graham-Rudman bill, which affects the budget and tries to put in line the budget so that we do not have and suffer from the tremendous deficits that this nation has experienced. But that forces upon you to make certain cuts in existing programs. Am I correct in that, Bob?
Graham-Rudman says that if the Congress and the President cannot agree on a certain level of cuts, that an automatic procedure will take over and cut across the board to achieve that same level of cuts, so that certain deficit targets are met in a programmed way until there's presumably a balanced budget by 1991. I believe that this year Congress is not going to be able to agree with the President about the nation's priorities, and I feel that we're probably headed for this automatic across-the-board cut. And the reason is that we've shuffled the deck a little bit. We've rearranged the deck chairs on the Titanic, but the Titanic is still headed downward, and that is because we have a certain political gridlock in this country, and that's reflected in the government because we are a democratic society. And that gridlock essentially is an argument between those who want to preserve domestic spending and those who want to preserve military increases. And factored into that, of course, is where do people stand relative to wanting taxes increased or revenues increased, and the whole national priorities debate. That gridlock that forced us to go to Graham-Rudman has not changed. Graham-Rudman has not changed the situation. It's merely altered the process. It's like, say, a drunk who knows he's really got to get out of the liquor cabinet, and one day, the only willpower that he can muster is to lock the liquor cabinet, put the key in an envelope, and send it to Fairbanks, Alaska. No offense to the people in Fairbanks, Alaska, but to send it a long distance away. He hasn't changed his willpower. Now he can smash the liquor cabinet, or he can fly to Fairbanks and get the key and go back. He's made getting into the cabinet more difficult, but he hasn't prevented getting into the cabinet. And he's changed the process. Well, Graham-Rudman is sort of a send your key to Fairbanks.
The important element is, what effect is this going to have upon our domestic programs generally?
Well, number one, I hope that this whole exercise is going to get us to change the budgetary process. Because, Les, the way we prepare budgets around here is completely ridiculous. I made a speech on the floor during the summer, and I said to my colleagues, would you build a house from the 5th floor down? No, you wouldn't. You'd build it from the ground floor up. But the only question we seem to ask around here in doing budgets is, what did we spend last year? And then we had 2% or 5%. It's nice to know, but I think the key question is, how did we spend it? Go back to the first dollar. It's called zero-based budgeting in business. Have every agency justify their needs from the first dollar up, if not annually, at least on the election cycle every 2 years, so we can begin to see what's happening. Because when you ask the only question, what did we spend, you institutionalize spending. The agencies then will try to spend everything before year end, and we've heard these egregious examples about how equipment is just dumped overboard, and you've heard many others. So on the one hand, we need to address the budget process. On the other, we've got to set priorities. I believe strongly that we cannot raise taxes in this country. I have yet to find someone in my district, Les, that feels that they're undertaxed. Okay, and
but how about those same people requiring of you the same services that they got before, and exactly the same type of aid to education, to mass transit, to all of the other factors that have been built into these budgets?
Okay, but the issue is not just program by program. It's what aspects of these programs are working, what aspects are not. Take student loans and small business. There was a feeling early on that we should eliminate student loans. I held strongly against that. I said, what doesn't work about the program? What doesn't work is the fact that we're not getting the money back. It's supposed to be an opportunity for an education. You get a job, you bring your money back. But we weren't enforcing the bring back of the money to make it a revolving fund. Small business. What didn't work about that were the direct loans. Government is lousy at being a bank.
But you're not going to knock out all those programs, are you?
You can modify them.
Well, my own plan out of this was a lot different than Graham-Rudman. I believe that every time we pass a program, we should give it some kind of an assignment of value as being either absolutely essential, such as the defense of the country, or things which are nice to have, they're enhancements, they do good things, but are really non-essential. So that when you get into a deficit situation, you could, if you're going to make something automatic, you could save and hold harmless those things which were absolutely essential, and I think most people would agree with that, and then have this graded system of nice but non-essential things that we will defer or forego. We never do that kind of an analysis. Every time we pass a program, we do it as though it was the most essential thing, and it probably was that day. But we don't say that this is important, but this is less important, and maybe this isn't important at all. And if we've got extra money, we can do that because it'd be good and nice, but it's not.
But how are you able to overcome the lobbying groups or the special interest groups that come into you and say, well, you know, you've said that my program is not essential, but it's something that we can perhaps consider to be a luxury?
Let me flip that around, Les. I think we'd have a better chance of telling somebody, yes, we can agree with the thing you want us to spend money on, which is going to help you. But let's not kid ourselves. You stand in relationship to the defense of the country in a lesser priority. Maybe you stand in relationship to, I don't know, something that's pretty much on the frivolous fringe as something more important. I think it would give people like me and my colleague the ability to go back to some people and give them at least partial satisfaction, at least say, yes, you are important, we do want to recognize you, but let's face it, in the total scheme of things, you're not as important as the survival of this country.
Yeah. That's putting this in a little different perspective. I think we have to realize that when we're talking about this Deficit Reduction Act, that we're really not cutting. Revenues will grow this year automatically without a tax increase, I understand, by some $75 billion. What we're suggesting is if the target is $200 billion, 1/5 this year would be $40 billion, just to make it simplistic. What we're doing is we're slowing down the rate of growth. And there's a reason for it. We have to borrow $150 billion, that's what it'd be, just to pay the interest this year. If that keeps up, the estimate is that 41 cents out of every dollar in 1991 will go just to pay the interest on the national debt. So we've got to do something. Now, setting our priorities, I agree wholeheartedly with Bob. We've got to do that. And each one of us may take a different approach to it. But frankly, if someone asked Joe DioGuardi, where would I start? I would say, well, right off the bat, I can't see increasing the military budget by 3% if we're going to then emasculate domestic programs. I'd say a freeze on that.
What about one of the things I know that's of interest to a great many people, especially in the New York area, and I don't know, I take it as well in Michigan, the question of the deduction of state and local taxes. What's going to happen to that from the federal tax picture?
Well, you've hit a big one here because that's a critical element in the thinking of the New York State delegation. And one of the reasons why I was so adamant after 3 calls from the White House and a 20-minute discussion with the Secretary of Treasury in voting against that rule on the Rosenkowski bill was that I feared that we could not trust that bill in the Senate. As I witnessed the Republicans trying to improve the bill by adding back the $2,000 non-spousal hour and other things, where did they get the money to keep it revenue neutral? They reduced the state and local deduction by 30%. And what did you see in the Times on Sunday? Senator Long saying that the state and local deduction has got to be tapped.
What do you think, coming from the Midwest, what do you think of that situation? How's that going to be resolved?
Well, I think the states of Wisconsin, Indiana, Illinois, Ohio, Michigan stood with New York's position on that. I don't trust the Senate any more than Joe does. Indeed, the news reports already show considerable backsliding on whatever commitments the senators have made. And of course, the complexion of the Senate's made up a lot differently than the House. Over there, they have 2 senators for every state, and rather than having 18...
Only up for re-election every 6 years.
Yeah, and in Michigan we have 2 senators and 18 members of the House, and in New York you got 2 senators and
34 members.
34 members of the House.
CPA to figure those percentages.
Illinois, so it turns out that those states which really need the deduction really are underrepresented in the Senate, and so I don't think I voted against the rule both times. And I don't think that the Senate's going to improve on that key provision for our states.
I think this is one of the big problems that exists, and that is the fact that here we've been talking about the billions of dollars that we have in deficit. The average person, when I was here in the House, I used to think in terms of those $1 billion. Now that I'm out of the House, I think in the area of tens and 50s and hundreds and thousands, because after all, that's what affects me as an individual, and I'm sure it affects the people who are sitting out there. And I think you've got to relate that a little bit more to the people at home as to just how they are going to be hit by this whole situation. Everybody wants to reduce the budget, but they sure do not want they themselves as individuals to be hit by this.
Well, I think that's true. I'd like to hear Joe speak about something, because he's the CPA, and I'll defer to him, but about this concept of capital budgeting. You know, if we're going to compare it to our own family budgets, I know that when I buy a car, I don't lay out the entire amount and the time I purchase it. I go get a loan, and if you include my loan in my budget isn't balanced every year either. It's balanced in that if I only limit it to my debt service, then I'm in balance. I get amused by governors around the country who talk about how they've balanced their budget and the federal government hasn't. Well, in point of fact, they're comparing an apple and an orange, because they're doing more in the way of capital budgeting, and we don't either. And I think maybe we ought to, but maybe Joe's got
Joe, we've got 1 minute. Can you tell us what it is about capital budgeting?
Well, there's no successful business that can do without one, because it's a good planning tool. Many of the things that we buy here in government have a useful life beyond 1 year, and they literally can be amortized or allocated over the yearly process for their economic worth. We tend to have one big pot and put everything in it, so we don't make a distinction between operating expenses and buying a building, let's say, or a missile. And we saw what happened in New York City in 1975. And New York City, by the way, had a capital budget, but they were beginning to meld the two and got into real trouble. So I think we need to do capital budgeting, because what we have is a system that forces us to make short-range decisions that in the long run cost us a lot of money.
I must intrude at this point. I'm sure that a lot of people would like to hear you go on, and we're going to ask you to come back again to go on and on about this. But unfortunately, our time has come to a close. And now, until next week at the same time, this is Lester Wolf saying so long from Washington.
The preceding program was brought to you by Blue Cross and Blue Shield.
Constitutional to spend more.
Both the city and the country of New York. It's a beautiful state.
Well, thank you very much, Congresswoman Lynn Martin, Congresswoman Barbara Boxer.
Thank you. I've enjoyed it.
And now until next week at this same time, this is Lester Wolf saying so long from Washington.
The preceding program was brought to you by Blue Cross and Blue Shield.